I'll just launch with my presentation. I do have a PowerPoint prepared here, so I can pop that open and share my screen if I have the ability to do that. I know that you're on a tight timeline here, and I think I was up until 11:25. So what I will do is make sure I'm aware of that timeline and leave lots of time for questions. And I assume that if anyone has any questions, they'll either be unmuted or just feel free to jump in. So let me see if I can get that deck up here. Okay. Let's see if we can. Good. Okay. So I'm assuming you can see the screen and everyone can hear me, and if not, certainly let me know. So let's get right into it because we don't have a ton of time here. So let's talk about the 5 W's of privacy laws. So what are privacy laws? So privacy laws are laws that apply to the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information for business purposes. So what that means is if you are collecting information about someone and you know who that person is, and you're doing it for running your business, then it's going to be subject to privacy laws. And so you might see that in terms of booking information, payment information, addresses, all of these things. That's information that if you're collecting it for the purpose of running your business, you're going to have to follow the privacy laws. What are the privacy laws? Well, in Canada, if you are in the private sector, then you need to, you're going to need to follow what we call the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. So we'll get into that in a second. That's a law that's been enforced since 2000, so it's been around for a while. And it applies to anyone who collects personal information from Canadian customers, or if you operate in Canada. So if you've got Americans coming up, you're going to have to follow that. And if you're collecting personal information from other Canadian customers, you're going to need to follow that law. Okay, so let's get into that. So the Personal Information Protection Act, or PIPEDA, you can see on the slide here, it's based on what we call fair information principles. And you can see there's 10 of them here. And so it's not one of those laws that would say, hey, you need to do A, B, and C, and if you don't, you've done something bad. Or if you do A, B, and C, everything's good. Instead, the way that it's supposed to work is they're supposed to be high-level principles, and you're supposed to adapt them to fit your particular circumstances. So just very briefly running through them here, you can see the first one is accountability. Accountability means you're responsible for your privacy obligations. That includes having a privacy policy, and we'll get into that. Identifying purposes means when you collect personal information from people, you need to tell them what you're collecting and why you're collecting it. Consent, in Canada, our privacy laws are based on the idea that, generally speaking, before you collect information from people and use it and share it, you're supposed to tell them that this is what you're doing and you get their agreement. And so sometimes someone will sign something, other times you will have a privacy policy, and if someone does business with you, they're deemed to accept the terms of your privacy policy. So that's no different than if you go on a website and scroll down to the bottom, there might be a link to a privacy policy. And so by using the website, you've been deemed to have accepted the terms of that privacy policy. Number 4, limiting collection. That's the idea that we don't collect more personal information than we need from people. For example, if you need to identify someone, there are lots of ways that you can identify someone other than asking for a SIN or a social insurance number. And so privacy laws would say, don't ask for a social insurance number. That's more information than you need. And that rolls into number 5, which is limiting use, disclosure, and retention. Don't do more than what you need with that information for the purposes that you collected it. If you get someone's name in your books, presumably you're not going to keep their credit card information forever. You're going to destroy it, and as and when they need another payment, say 2 or 3 years down the road, if they come back, recollect the information at that time. Accuracy, you're responsible for making sure the information that you hold about people is correct. And so if it's incorrect and someone says, I want you to update that, here's my new address, you would need to facilitate that. Safeguards, you're supposed to take reasonable measures to protect personal information. So a lot of the times for you, that's just going to mean that you're contracting with reasonable people to do what needs to be done. You probably don't operate your own website. You probably use a service provider to take payments, you know, whether it's the Monerises of the world or what have you. So you want to make sure you're choosing wisely. Openness and individual access, 8 and 9. That's giving people the opportunity to understand how you're using their personal information if they ask you. And finally, number 10, challenging compliance. That's the idea that if someone wants to make a complaint about the way you've dealt with their personal information, that you will listen to them and take the action that needs to be taken. So that's the very high level stuff. I know it's kind of boring and not necessarily super practical. So let's get into that a little bit more detail, some things that you can actually action. So the first thing is, when we talk about the accountability principle, that's why I'm talking to you today. The accountability principle under privacy law says you need to have a privacy policy. It's actually a requirement under our laws. You don't necessarily need to put it out there for everyone to see, but you need to turn your mind towards having a privacy policy. And that takes us now to the next question, which is what ought to be in your privacy policy. So in the next few slides, I'll talk about some of the key terms. You don't need to have a 2,000-page privacy policy that was clearly written by a lawyer and someone looks at it, they'll never understand what it means. You don't need to have a privacy policy that might look like what you would see on the iTunes store, for example. But you do need to have some basic principles, and that's what we're going to walk through here. Very important, because privacy laws are based on consent, you need to tell people what information you're going to be collecting from them. And so that's part of getting permission from people. Again, it's not necessarily giving them a signed contract or telling them face-to-face, but it might be having terms and conditions on your website that explains, here's the information we're going to collect from you, here's why we're collecting it, and so on and so forth. And that's the second point is, if privacy is based on consent and getting permission, people need to understand what it is you're collecting and how you're collecting it. So am I getting information that my customers are providing to me? If someone goes and books, you know, a week at my lodge, are they doing it directly on the website? Are they doing it by a phone call? Likely that's the case for you. Sometimes you're going to have indirect collection or collection being collected from a third party. Probably not so applicable to you folks. It's not like you're going to be doing background checks, I assume, or at least anytime I've booked a place, I don't know that anyone's had background checks on me, but that's another piece to think about. Very important, explain to people the reasons why the personal information is going to be used. Presumably it's so that you can get the place ready, so that you know when they're coming. It's so that you can collect payment from their credit card or otherwise. Maybe they're giving you dietary restrictions. Maybe they're giving you arrangements in terms of who's going to stay in what cabin. These are all things that are done for the purpose of making sure that they'll have a comfortable and happy stay with you. Sometimes, and you may do this, you might do follow-up marketing with people. So someone books with you and you decide that you're going to send them email addresses or a newsletter, and hopefully that will incent them to come back. If you're going to use their information for marketing purposes, you're going to want to explain to them how you're going to do that and what that's going to look like. Sharing the information, if the information is going to someone else, you need to tell them and let them know that. Typically, that's probably not going to be something that will happen for you, but maybe you belong to an association or you do third-party marketing where you give information to someone else and someone else then markets to these people. If that's the sort of thing you're doing, you're sharing email addresses for that purpose, you would want to make sure you're telling people about that. How long you'll keep personal information is important. We talked about not collecting more personal information than you need to and not holding on to it for longer than you need to. So that's something that is important. You want to make sure you're being clear about that in your policy. And a lot of the times businesses trip up because they have this database that they never look at. They never cull the names out that they no longer have any relationship with. And so then if you do have a privacy breach, you've got more and more information that was exposed, as opposed to if you had some policy in place, some retention schedule that says, if we haven't done business with someone for X years, then we delete that information. So those are good things to have, and you should be telling people about that. Protecting personal information, again, could be quite basic for you, but if you've got a website, maybe your website uses encryption. If you're using payment providers, maybe you're using payment providers who only follow best practices, industry standards, those sorts of things. That's something that you would see in a privacy policy. Oftentimes you're going to have third parties or service providers who have access to personal information. Most commonly for you folks, that would be if you have a payment provider. So in that situation, when someone gives you a credit card number, that credit card number is going to be accessed and given to a payment provider. You may not have a server on your premises or that you own. Maybe your business operates what's called in the cloud. So you've got your data hosted like in Microsoft 365 or something like that. So Microsoft would be a service provider there. And so if you use service providers to host your data in the cloud, you would tell people about that. How you respond to privacy breaches. So this is very important because in Canada now, if you're a business and you've got personal information and that personal information gets accessed by someone who shouldn't have accessed it for an improper purpose, you may have to notify the people whose information was compromised. And you've probably yourself received emails to that effect. Maybe you're a member of a website or you bought something from a website or you stayed at a hotel, and then you get an email that says, customer, we suffered a privacy breach. Here's what happened. Here's what we know. We think your information may have been compromised. Here's who you can contact for more information. If you have any questions or concerns, we offer credit monitoring, those sorts of things. The reason why you're seeing all those emails is because in Canada, it is now the law that if you have a privacy breach and people's personal information is accessed and there's a harm threshold that's crossed, that the harm has created a real risk of significant harm is the term that we use. Then you have a legal obligation to notify both the people who were affected and also the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, which is like your privacy police. And so very important, you want to talk about that and think about if I have a privacy breach, how am I going to respond? And you can include some of that in your privacy policy. So very important in Canada. Important to know that it's not all privacy breaches that require you to report to the people who were affected in the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. It's only those that pass a risk threshold or a harm threshold. So if I send an email to someone and it turned out I sent it to the wrong customer and it should have gone to someone else, if I'm not including payment information in that email, if I'm not giving someone a credit card, I should never be emailing credit card information in the first place, of course. That's better taken by phone or through a safe website portal. But let's say that I accidentally email someone and I don't really disclose any sensitive information, then it may well be that in those circumstances, you don't have to report because the harm threshold wasn't crossed. Typically, we're talking about things where people's payment information has been compromised, or if you've got identity documents, if you have passports or driver's license, those are the sorts of things where we're a little bit more concerned and you would have an opportunity to or you would have an obligation rather to provide privacy breach notification. And then the last thing is, we talked about earlier how you want to be accountable, you want to be open to people. So in your privacy policy, it's always a good idea to have contact information for someone who can be contacted if people have questions about privacy. And you can see that on this list. You got questions about how the information is being handled. Maybe they think that there's a mistake in the information. They don't want you to have their personal information anymore. Maybe they don't want you to send them emails anymore, or they want to make a complaint. So in your privacy policy, you will typically tell people, if you have any concerns or questions, here's who you can contact. So that's sort of privacy from 30,000 feet. I know we've got a few minutes, and so I thought, I'm not sure if we're equipped to do this, but if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions. I see the chat box here, so if you send a chat message and it's something that I can see, I could certainly answer that. And other than that, you know, if anyone else has any questions or comments, happy to speak to that. So I'll throw it back to you, Noel, I guess, and see whether anyone has any questions or comments.
For sure. Thank you very much, Andrew. That was awesome. Yeah, if anybody has any questions for Andrew, you can ask in the chat box, or you can, if you'd like, you can unmute your mic and ask directly. So we've got some time. So absolutely, if you've got questions, please take this opportunity to ask them.
Thanks. That was a good presentation.
Thank you. I should say too, I am happy to, after this presentation, I can send these slides to the association and see if they have the ability to make them available to the attendees. I'm happy to do that. So I'll certainly do that. So I see a question here in the chat box. Would most payment systems have built-in insurance with their plans? Great question. I would check with the service provider to see. I think typically the approach that is taken is when you have personal information that's compromised, and it's compromised in the hands of someone else who's collected it, like a payment provider, then the legal obligation is with that payment provider rather than with you. If all you're doing is funneling someone to another website or another portal to take payment and you don't run that, and that person suffers a breach, then it's that payment portal provider who would be responsible, as distinct from, let's say you've got a database where you've stored payment information and that database gets hacked. Another question, a rough guesstimate on cost to produce a basic privacy policy. It depends on how basic you want to be. I would say probably anywhere from $500 to $1,000 if it's a basic privacy policy. A lot of it depends on how much work the business can do. At least from my perspective, a lot of the process for me is having a discussion with the business and understanding what information you're collecting and going through all those questions that I just went through. If you are able to sort of give your lawyer, whoever that is, or even if you want to try doing it yourself, I suppose then there's no cost to you. But the more information you can provide to answer the questions that we've gone through in the slide, the more you can do to bring down your costs. All right, another question here. Merchant accounts have online vaults to store credit card info. We assume those are safe. What's the proper wording when telling people their info will be stored in that vault? So typically, what I would say is if it's a third-party service provider, what you would have in your privacy policy is something that says, we may give you access to third-party service providers. When you give information to those third parties, such as payment processors, please know that your information will be protected in accordance with the terms and conditions of those people's policies. So the idea is to gently steer them towards those people so that in the event that there is an issue, they know who to go to, because that's not really something you can control anymore. Just checking the time here. I see it's 11:27. Any other questions? Certainly send them in. Otherwise, I'll just stand by here until we're ready to move on to the next part. Okay, I think that's about it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Thank you, everyone. I hope you found that useful. I guess I'll throw it back now to the association and have a good rest of your meeting. Thank you very much.